It's preparing the live stream. Go for it.
Welcome to the IIFX podcast series. Today, we're going to discuss why sports and entertainment venues and technologies need the Safety Act, along with my colleague, Jim Mercurio, who's Senior Managing Consultant and, of course, IIFX Distinguished Fellow. We welcome you today. Today's a very important subject to discuss. As we look at the fan journey, there's an expectations by the fans that safety and security are number one when it comes to their assurance of a great journey. So today we wanted to spend some time with a great panel, by the way, to look at how, and what we talk about really is basically their experiences from the committee standpoint or the panel standpoint, earning a Safety Act designations and certification for their venues and their technologies. But I thought maybe before we even begin, let me give you kind of a definition from the Department of Homeland Security. Really, what is the Safety Act? So the Safety Act really applies to a wide range of technologies, including products and services and software and other forms of intellectual property that are designed or modified to identify, detect, and deter and respond to or otherwise mitigate the impact of harm arising from the act of terrorism. So protections apply only to claims arising out of, relating to, or resulting from a form of act of terrorism. So this is our discussion today. Jim?
Oh, good morning, Lou, and thanks for having me part of this process. I've had the pleasure of working with all the folks that you're going to hear from today, but I'd like to take a moment to introduce to you John Petrone from Petrone Risk. We'll take you through some of the guidelines and in some cases challenges, but for the most part, kind of an outline of how to go through the Safety Act process. I've had the actual pleasure of working with he and his team personally and professionally. So I do want to take the moment and introduce John. And John, take it away. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Dr. Lou, and thank you, IIFX. The fan journey is everything. Safety and security for the fan is everything, and if we can all make that a little bit better in the things we do, we're doing our job, and we tend to do that through IIFX. So thank you. Safety Act. Everybody knows a little bit about it. Everybody sometimes think they're a little bit of an expert. I know that. I would do it. I think it's too hard. Maybe it doesn't fit for me. Well, I think there's a fit for everybody out there. And it's understanding it. It's knowing what you have to do. And I think with the group today, myself as a consultant, Rick Fenton with regard to facilities and being really a star with regard to Safety Act and obtaining Safety Act for facilities, and Kathleen Griggs regarding technologies, really forms the basis for what's important and the processes they've gone through. Safety Act, how to come about after 9/11. It was time that we did things better. We did things in a little more secure and safer basis, obviously, based upon the knowledge that we gained. And the key is based upon the knowledge that we gained, because once Safety Act came about, every day the knowledge we gain changes. Therefore, the work we do with regard to resiliency and evolution of our processes changes. And that's something to hold that's very important for Safety Act and to hold an acknowledgement you may get. Going back to post 9/11, the other key was we wanted folks with facilities, technologies to do things in a way that made them better, but not susceptible to liability, so that they were afraid to do or to make changes. And it was key that the Safety Act process came out. With regard to the Safety Act process, we think of Safety Act, and for one to gain it, one has to have what we call the qualified anti-terrorism technology. Right away, if you don't know Safety Act very well, you say, gee, that's a technology, that's a widget. How could a facility gain Safety Act? How could a security services group gain Safety Act? Well, that QATT can go to a technology, or that qualified anti-terrorism technology can be your practices and procedures. And if it's your practices and procedures, thus facilities come into play. Their practices and procedures are their qualified anti-terrorism technology that opens the door for Safety Act. Security groups, people that are helping to guard or helping to keep safe those facilities. It's their practices and procedures that avail them to Safety Act. And obviously, with regard to technologies, and we think of many different technologies out there from which Safety Act could be gained, access control, camera systems, to name a few. And these are the types of technologies as we move forward, command center integrations with regard to different technologies at large facilities or smaller facilities, entertainment or sports related, university related, and the list goes on, corporate related. So there's room for each. Now, with regard to Safety Act, if you're a technology, you have to put together documentation that proves certain things in order for you to obtain Safety Act. You got to look and see if does your technology conform to the standards set forth by the seller. They're looking at the development of the technology and how it was developed. Once it was developed, does it perform as it's intended to? What were the quality assurance studies, the third-party studies, the end-user studies? And then lastly, is the technology safe to use as intended? It's out there in the market. There's folks that are using it. There's been incident reporting. We've been able to show, hey, this technology can work and has worked in these type of situations at these type of facilities with regard to these third-party users. These all become important. If you're a security provider, what are your standard operating procedures? What's your vetting and training process? What's your training manual look like? This documentation becomes very important. And if you're a facility, what are your plans and procedures? Your EOPs, emergency operation plans, standard operating procedures, business continuity plans. How are those plans tested? Are there tabletop testing? Is there testing of other items that you have with regard to your practice? In your standard operating procedures, how does your command center and the technologies they have play in? And it becomes the basis for each of these become the basis to obtain a Safety Act or the road to Safety Act. The key is it's not developing this once. Okay, it's not developing it for 1 year and say, oh, okay, I'm going to do my Safety Act application because I just created all these things and I think I'm in a good place. Well, the key with Safety Act, the other key is you learn who you are, who your facility is, who your technology is, who your security team is, because it's not one and done. It's developing over a number of years with regard to each acknowledgement, which I'll talk about in a second as we go through the process. What are the levels of protection? And you've got them in front of you here. Designation or deter give you the same type of protection, and that's a liability cap that's set forth by the Department of Homeland Security when you're applying in this process. That cap, depending if you're a facility or a technology, differs. If it's a facility, let's say maybe it's $50 million in terrorism insurance. What's it mean? If, God forbid, there was a catastrophe, you would not pay more than the limits of liability if you were a designated facility, or if you were a designated technology, or if you were a designated security company. DTED comes into play with regard to time periods. Usually you have to show a 3-year sample set of all the documentation that I just talked about in the different areas to obtain designation. But what if you're a new facility and the new facility's got some great items in place, but they've got no time period? What's going to happen is the Safety Act office is going to come in and they're going to look at DTED coverage for you. And why is that DTED coverage there? Because you don't have a sample set. You can't have a sample set. The interesting things with the new facilities are they may have the greatest technologies in the world, but they've never been tested. So where do you start? You start at that DTED level, and there's a protection there. What happens down the line? Either through a modification, depending on what your designation level is, or through a re-acknowledgement. You look to obtain certification. Why do you look to obtain certification? Because certification gives you the government contractor's defense of absolute and total immunity. I just spoke about a catastrophe that could happen, could be terrorist related, domestic or international. Okay. If you've got certification, there's liability cap is not there. It's the government contractor's defense of absolute and total immunity. I don't know where in the world you can get absolute and total immunity. Thus, we go back to the application process and the processes and the documentation that's necessary. If you're going to get this type of protection for a period of time, and you're going to keep this type of protection, the documentation has to be there, the evolution of the security program has to be there, and it all has to be documented. And we're going to hear in a couple minutes from Rick and Kathleen. And the other thing is, what has to happen is threat vulnerabilities change. They changed from 5-6 years ago. Sometimes they change from yesterday to today. So those threat vulnerabilities come into play and are very important with regard to what you're doing evolution-wise with your program. Additionally is, where is your facility? Where is the technology being used? Is it downtown Manhattan? Is it somewhere in Idaho? Is it in a small town? Is it out in the country? How does it all fit? And those affect your threat vulnerability. I said enough and hopefully given you some good background here, but to actually get into the processes, we've got some great professionals here in Rick and Kathleen. So I'd like to send it to Rick on the facilities end, and then maybe Kathleen on the technology end, and then we'll come back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, John. The graph that we just had up showing the various stages, and I think we should start with the pre-application process. And when folks are talking to me and their venues are considering it, we were fortunate in that we got certification for a very old venue, our ballpark where the Detroit Tigers play, and we got certification for a brand new venue, Little Caesars Arena. And so those were two distinct different types of applications, much more difficult to do an old venue versus a new. But where I think you need to start is with the pre-application process. And within the pre-application process, it's your first chance to really engage the Safety Act office, and I'm using the word intentionally, engage. You will find them very, very open to assisting your efforts, in particular to defining what your technology is. And John, in his introduction, showed a variety of different things from services and programs and processes to actual technology. And how you blend that in. Are you interested in event only, or are you interested in non-event and event? Are you interested in 24/7 coverage, or are you focused on just your screening processes? All of those kinds of things could be applications for Safety Act certification. In our case, for the ballpark, it was a comprehensive application for the security program. For the arena, John pointed out having 3 years of background materials to share. So we actually did 2 applications. We did an application for the security design, which we were successful in getting certification. But our security program, because we didn't have the 3 years that John talked about, we actually received designation. And as we move into the renewal process, we're now combining those two from a certification and a designation into one singular application for renewal. And once again, we sat down with the Safety Act and discussed that. I'd like to turn it over to Kathy so she can talk a little bit about how it's different actually doing an application for technology.
I'm Kathleen Griggs with Data Buoy. We have a technology which is gunshot detection. Just want to make sure everybody understands that. It is a new technology, and it's not something that everyone is familiar with. And so the application process is intimidating for any technology to go into initially. And I think there's a lot to learn in terms of it's more than just, does your system perform to spec, right? You know, evaluation of performance is only a piece of it. There are a lot of other things that Safety Act looks at and requests information on that you may or may not as a company be prepared to answer. And so I think there's a road to getting there. Just like John said, you know, you may start with a DT&E or developmental test, but you need to understand that this is a road that requires some experience on the ground and with your tech, with users. And so, you know, that's kind of an important thing, is how do you plan to, you know, fill in all of those different areas. And so it's really good probably to review what the Safety Act is looking for before you even do the pre-application, and then discuss it with them. And like Rick said, the pre-application is really important because they're a very their group is trying to help you, and they're a very amenable group to someone who wants to come in and try to understand how they would do that better. So that's one thing, one step as a technology. As a new technology, there's some challenges, right, to making sure that you as a new technology are something that users are prepared to utilize. And that was one of our tech challenges, is to find a user community or a user that was willing to help us validate, the standard operating procedures that they're asking about, validate the effectiveness. And safe to use is another area that John mentioned. You think, well, that's kind of crazy. Of course, this is not going to hurt anyone. It might not fall off the wall and kill someone, but that's really not what they're talking about. They want to know if that user, when they incorporate that in their existing security practices, does it get absorbed and enhance their effectiveness, or does it cause problems with their program? And so these are all things that you need to work with the user on, and with your with that partner. And so I kind of want to throw a mention out to IIFX and how they facilitate that, because not everybody has information on what that technology might be effective for, and to make that connection, speak to the user about how this technology might help them. And then, and they supported us all the way through that evaluation process and the evaluation of the effectiveness of the technology. I mean, that's hugely important, because with our tech, it's not just the matter of detecting a gunshot, but, is it accurate enough to actually locate the shooter? Will the message get there in time? What can the user do with the message? Does it enhance their operations? And these are all user interactions beyond performance. So I just want to kind of mention that. And then again, the threat, our technology addresses a threat that is a fairly new threat, I think, added to the Safety Act, what we called it the QATT, the qualified anti-terror tech. This is a terror threat that not everyone, I think, even thought about several years ago, but this is something that I think has been validated. This high-angle shooter, which is the idea of a shooter shooting from a garage or an apartment building into a crowd. Unfortunately, because of something like Mandalay Bay, it's become more recognized as a threat. So our technology addresses, that specific threat. And so I just want to continue one more mention of the fact that Safety Act, on the technology side, if we get Safety Act designation or certification, it is incorporated if a buyer buys their technology, it is incorporated that if that event happened, that our technology is designed to mitigate, right? So high angle shooter, we're Safety Act designated for a high angle shooter threat. So if that were to happen and you're utilizing our technology, then that goes over to our company as a tech, right? But maybe, but we don't stop bombs, right? So, just to be clear that this is where technology designation fits into your overall program. So, those are a few things on our experience, and I'm going to turn it back over to John and see wherever.
Thanks, Kathleen. I think it's interesting, and we've been talking a little bit about resiliency, and with that comes, okay, I'm Rick Fenton. I got my acknowledgement. Okay, I've got my stadium, I've got my arena, and then all of a sudden, Village, which is an outstanding organization and corporation, decides we can really build up. And what you're seeing throughout the country are multi-use facilities, are building around stadiums and arenas, high-rise building, different threat vulnerabilities. And I kind of like to bring that up and go to Rick again and kind of see how the marriage occurred with regard to Rick's facility and Kathleen's product, and how things change. Whereas when he first went in and did the application, that threat purpose or that threat piece really wasn't there, but changed. So with that, Rick, and maybe Kathleen, you could add to it.
Yep. So it's a great lead in, and the reality is, so if we go back to when we submitted the arena application, which was in 2015, the security design was actually put together with a variety of consultants. Dr. Liu actually participated in that. But we worked very, very closely with the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, came up with a lot of protective measures that were state of the art at the time. But John, you touched on this. Time moves, time changes. So as the leagues come in with new standards and new threats are, so maybe 10 years ago, we were talking about terrorist threat, and it was pre-operational surveillance, planned activities. Then we started getting concerned about people renting cars and running people over. Then Vegas happened, and we saw what would happen with high elevation. So as we started looking at new threat streams, the Safety Act Office demanded that we show that the protective measures we put in the arena were still current, but what new technologies? Well, John, you hit it right in the head. Our application actually encompasses the District Detroit, which is the development area around the arena. We're in an urban area with buildings. And so how could we detect elevated shooters from an elevated platform? And we began looking for technology. We were stumbling all over the place. And along came IIFX and said, we've actually identified a vendor that's developed that type of technology. Then it became a partnership between us and Kathleen's company so that we could prove to the Safety Act Office that this new technology that she was developing and got a tremendous amount of brain power in would do what is supposed to do. And then for us, it solved that elevated platform within our development area. And so it's a wonderful story between IIFX identifying a technology and us partnering with Kathleen to work with the Safety Act to not only get her designation application through, but actually to renew our certification application. So it's a wonderful story of blending the three interests into one successful application. So Kathy, jump in there, go ahead.
I think it is. So these are questions that we would not be able to answer on the Safety Act application. It is very much it definitely involves the user. It involves you telling Safety Act Office, what is the threat that your technology mitigates? What is the evidence that it is a terror threat? What is the evidence that a user can utilize your technology, and they're looking for evidence. They're looking for evidence that requires user involvement, right? So the users are really part of that application. So we don't have, and when you get to designation, you need to have users that not only have you had your system out there in the field for multiple years, so you can demonstrate the performance, you can demonstrate effectiveness. So we've demonstrated effectiveness measures in with our other deployments, but they're not necessarily deployments that have that critical terror threat like an arena. That's like what Rick Fenton's group is looking at. So we have, so that you don't have to focus on one user for all of the metrics that they're looking for, right? You can combine your product experience in all of these different places to just demonstrate the performance, how messages get through, how the response is handled. And now when you go to that user that has that terror threat, you have that part of it, that behind it, then that user validates that experience. And so that's where we found we had a lot of, it was a different collection of evidence cases, but you need to provide proof for every one of their questions. And so if you don't have that and you need to go out and get it, you need to have, specific third parties that are willing to evaluate your performance. And we had a nice, clean way to do that with Rick's group. They had the FBI range test for us so that we can cleanly demonstrate these are the metrics. And so they did a lot of facilitating as we integrated it into their system. So having a user that has that kind of experience in, let's just say that they're seeking Safety Act. So they're on top of these things, and that makes it a lot easier for us to integrate our tech into that group.
And I think, John, one of the interesting parts of the conversation was they asked Kathy and us exactly that. Why do you need that? And so I said, well, you provided Safety Act to the NFL, to NBA, and Major League Baseball, and every one of their best practices says there's a threat stream out there called active shooter and elevated shooter. And I have these 25 DHS intelligence bulletins that say I should be concerned about an elevated shooter. Well, the minute we said that, then they're like, okay, we agree. Now, how are you going to test it? And to Kathy's credit, that's when we engaged the FBI. But it was like, we had to document, why did we think that we needed it? Which I thought was obvious, but it was okay. We showed them the documents from the leagues and the bulletins. And then Kathy was willing to get together with the FBI and actually engage them in testing. So it was a wonderful marriage between a technology and a venue and actually the Safety Act office. So, and Jim, I know you've gone through that yourself when you were doing stuff at Levi. So,
Yeah, Jim,
In
can I
fact,
ask your thoughts?
I have, Rick, but you being the, shall we call you the grandfather or the, well, maybe we'll say the godfather
I am old.
of Safety Act, implementation. I'd wonder if you talk a minute about, one, how long did it take from start to finish, whether it was for the new building or for the old building, and then talk a little bit about what happened afterwards or what changed as a result of you getting Safety Act designated and or certified, and what that means for, people that are listening today and down the road.
So I'll take that last point that you made, Jim, because when you're meeting with your corporate leaders, and they're looking at all of these associated costs, they're always going to say, "What's in it for us?" And so, from my perspective, our CEO and president had already gone through Safety Act with the ballpark, and he was very supportive of the process, and I think he was especially supportive of the process when he could go to Major League Baseball meetings, and quite frankly, it was only us and the New York Yankees who had it, and he actually understood that, and he understood that we were saving money on insurance companies. So there became a hook, Jim. So as we began to look at the arena, what I can say is bluntly, we're saving about $200,000 a year in insurance premiums between the two venues based on having Safety Act certification at both places. So if you were doing it for no other reason than you were looking at costs, there is a documented savings to us from a corporate perspective. The other side is being a venue of excellence. You want to pursue the best guest services. We want to hopefully be good again on the ice. We want to hopefully be good again on the basketball court, and we want to hopefully be good again on the ball field. But at the end of the day, we want our guests to have a wonderful experience, Jim. And the reality is being safe and secure in an urban environment, attending a major venue, we want our guests to go away and understand that we've done everything that we can to protect them.
And let's not underestimate that, right? I think people nowadays, especially, are trying what it is that you're doing to making sure my grandkids and my wife and my husband and girlfriend and whomever else is coming with us and our parties are in fact safe. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the intangible benefits of Safety Act certification in that regard. I mean, you kind of touched on it, but and then I think for me, one of the things that I felt that was kind of a unexpected result of going through this process is that the documentation of what you're doing, the renewal each year, sometimes every month, of the things that you're doing helped the team and the staff stay organized and improved kind of that communication. I would imagine you would have felt that same way, and if so, maybe talk a little bit more about that. Well,
I think you and I have talked about this before, and our experience was the same. It actually became a team building exercise for the entire staff. And this isn't, John already said this is not a one-time thing. So when you're looking at your guest screening processes, it's bringing the staff together to write that procedure. It's bringing the staff together to actually train to that standard. It's developing the quality assurance testing internally. We already know the leagues are going to do that, Jim, but the reality is, what are your quality assurance testing measures? And John talked about this in terms of resilience. What measures have you developed so that you can test that technology? Those are all benefits. We became a stronger staff because of the process, because ultimately we worked collaboratively together. It wasn't the Rick Benton show. It was a variety of folks from operations, guest services, and security coming together for a common purpose. And it remains that way because it's the only way that you can stay current, Jim.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Rick. I think the one challenge that I still see out there is that there is a little bit of a drop off or a letdown sometimes once you get Safety Act designation or certification, and you don't pay attention to the following year. You normally get it for what, 5 years, and what I would say is resist saying we don't have to do anything for the next 4 years until renewal, right? And I think that sometimes could set in. But maintaining that level of certification and designation, can you talk about the differences between certification and designation versus recertification, right? So when you get designated, is it a 5-year process? How do you get recertified? When do you start recertifying? And what is the difference between that and certification and getting recertified? The names designation and certification can sometimes be confusing to people. So maybe you can kind of clear that up for the audience.
So what I would say is we have been fortunate that we started out with 5-year certifications and we started out with a 5-year designation, but that has changed. And John, I'm sure will weigh in here in a second, and you will see a lot coming out now that are 3-year. And that's because the Safety Act office itself is actually looking at these applications with a great deal more detail. And so the recertification process, in my mind, and John, please jump in here, starts the day that you get the award. If you don't go at it with that perspective, you're not going to be successful in the renewal process. The renewal process for the ballpark was decidedly different, Jim, and thanks for throwing that out, than the arena. So the ballpark was showing continuous improvement, addressing new threats, and how have your processes changed? And we were able to document continuous improvement over the last 5 years. Interesting enough, the arena application became very much different. We renewed the security design in May of 2023. The Safety Act office came to us the next day and said, you are going to be renewing your security program next year. Would you consider moving those together? Well, now it became a little bit of a negotiation, Jim, and whether you're using a great firm like Patron Risk, or you're using Pillsbury Law, which we use, and Brian Finch in the boats, it became a discussion of what is that application going to look at, and I think what we need to say to the folks that are listening is it's not a one-way road with the Safety Act office. It's an open engagement, and it's a collaborative kind of a process. And so we literally sat down and said, well, we would want to transition from designation to certification. There's a whole set of questions that are different with a certification application than a designation application. That's a technical thing that John can get into. But then what is this going to look at? And to be candid, what is going to be that certification period? Are you going to give me a combined one for 3 years, but I could have gone 5 years with the security design and I would have been farther along? That all became a consideration in terms of the ongoing discussion with them, all of which we worked out, and we'll be submitting that application at the end of this month. So all good questions, Jim.
I think if I can add to that, you got the you've gotten the acknowledgement, whether it be certification or designation, and you're sitting there and say, we did it. And as Rick said, it starts the next day. And I think the key is having a group, if it's not inside, you're not doing it inside, that can work with you, that is not only Safety Act expertise, not only has Safety Act expertise, but there's an emergency preparedness expertise, so that they can work with you consistently to make sure that your documents are where they should be, and the documents are put together, and the threats that are changing are being addressed, and yearly basis, the things that have to be done are being done. Because what happens otherwise is there's different department heads have different documentation. That documentation or that department head leaves and another department head comes in, and maybe there's not that consistency or cohesiveness. what we do and what we've done at our firm is we've developed a technology that we use with our clientele. And I know that maybe Rick can talk on a little bit that he's piloting now with MLB, so as to not only help the organizations work with regard to the development of their Safety Act process and as they go through the reapplication process, but also helps them in working with the league to provide the documentation it has to provide on a yearly basis pursuant to best practices, and make sure the folks that have to do those things are lined out to do those things. And there's knowledge, well, this wasn't completed, there's a 15-day warning, or we did this but in a different way, or the threat has changed, we see something in best practices change, we have to do this a little bit differently. So I've hit it on a general piece. Maybe Rick, you could add to it.
Well, Jim, you touched on this. It's like, what's the difference between getting it and the renewal process? And so I'll use the ballpark because we're working with John's firm and Major League Baseball to develop this. But essentially, that application initially was 25,000 pages. When it was renewed, it was up around 30,000 pages. And when you're looking at that over a 5-year certification period, it's like, where the hell do I store all of these documents? How do I hit the milestones to make sure that I'm doing certain things at certain steps? And we were doing that in a very clumsy way through a spreadsheet process. Bluntly, John came along doing some work with Major League Baseball, and we sat down with Major League Baseball and John's firm and said, do you have a system that, A, we can report stuff to Major League Baseball, like self-audits and things like that, and B, what would it look like? Because now Major League Baseball is mandating that all the clubs, Jim, pursue Safety Act. And John's like, well, we actually have a database that does this. And so we entered into a pilot agreement with John's firm and Major League Baseball, because in our case, we do have 2 certifications that are in the shelf. And so now we're literally piloting this program that allows us to actually report documents to the league, but at the same time creating a database for our renewal process that we never had before. So it's actually been once again, it's been a win-win. John is a Major League Baseball vendor, but us as, quite frankly, somebody who's going to use that product and being a Major League Baseball venue. So.
And I've actually seen John in action, and I think that is extremely helpful because it's overwhelming. Let's be candid, right? This could be we're doing some right when you're doing this on your own internally. Sometimes you're not able to put forth the kind of effort that needs to be kind of in place, right? John is the only thing that he's focusing on while you're having to run the building and the stadium, and you're implementing Data Buoy Corporation technology, and you're still testing this, right? There's all these other things, and let's not forget that the fan is coming on Sunday at 1:00, and you've got a concert the next day, and you're ripping out the field the next week. So there's so many other things that you have to do. So to be able to rely on John and his team and having that kind of depository of sorts, I think is quite helpful. So yeah, congratulations on the 2 of you, because I think you've been, well, it's not even you think, you've been a leader in this industry for several years, and it's great to see you guys come together and make this hopefully easier for everybody else that's looking to do it.
Let me ask Rick and Kathleen, how can IIFX help in the future, Kathleen, for technologies that are looking for the Safety Act, for venues, Rick, that are looking for Safety Act assistance? How can we help?
I'm going to start with, from our perspective, the Safety Act office is there as they continue to move the bar up, and they were identifying threats, right? And whereas our threat wasn't really specifically spelled out in previous years, and the outdoor threat from gunfire, elevated shooter is now on the board as being something that any new Safety Act applicant is going to have to look at and create a plan for, which enabled us to fit into that environment. And now that our technology is something that can address that threat, it's early adopters that are first pulling in this and doing this hard work and creating that, that evidence that says this is something that can effectively mitigate it. And I think as the Safety Act is evolving, I think how the sports and entertainment world responds to that threat and how they're going to answer that is something that IIFX has been doing, and that's how we got into this so fast. I noticed that on the Safety Act applicant list, if you go onto the website, you can see it's heavily there's a lot of sports and entertainment venues that are in that Safety Act certification process, probably more than a lot of other industries. You know, I don't see a lot of amusement parks or malls or anything like this, but they could all be following the lead here. But you guys are really at the in lead position, and so the more you define and the better you define the details around the specification, how our system addresses it, the easier it gets for everybody, right? You know, because it's all about creating those definitions. And we were going to talk about this. I know we mentioned this early on, but as a technology, one of the hardest parts of this application is defining your system, right? What are the boundaries of your system? How do you integrate that system effectively? And they're just looking for ways to define the problem and define the effectiveness. And, you know, I think IIFX is really putting the lead in there on that. That's how I think you guys are helping. But Rick, I'll turn it over to you. And
I'll answer it a little bit different, Lou. So, and I think Jim would agree with me. And I look at this list of participants on this podcast. I don't have enough time in a day to take calls from all of the vendors that call me on the phone, or quite frankly, send me something through the mail. I don't have enough time in a day to do that. So an organization like IIFX, through your consulting side of the picture here, is really a great feeder, if you will, to a venue like ours, where you're looking at the different technologies and you're developing white papers, and you're looking at that critically. And you've got people like Jim Mercurio, who ran a major venue for longer than I've been involved in this. So I may be the old guy, but Jim's been involved in this business longer than I have. But at the end of the day, he's looking at that technology as he would if he was back in the day where he's running that venue. And then he can come to me with a high degree, quite frankly, of credibility and say, so Rick, this is a new video management system that I think does X. You might want to be one of those venues that signs up to take a look at this. That's how we came across Kathy. If Kathy would have called me, I'm just going to be blunt, I probably wouldn't have returned the call. And yet she became the solution, Lou. But the reality is that you guys pre-vetted that. You knew what I was looking for. And so I have trust in what you guys are all about. And so the reality it was, Rick, take a look at this. And it was worth my time. And then once I could focus on that, then it was like, you're right. This is something that I need to jump into. And then Kathy and I became partners in that. But I think that's the role in this new area where you're building this consulting side of the house, where you can like vet stuff that's out there, marry it up with the appropriate venue, and let's take it for a ride. And then it's something where we can get out in conferences and stuff and say, if you're looking for something from an elevated shooter, look at X. It's shot point. If you're looking for a video management system, look at B. It's this. And I think that's the critical role that you guys could play, Lou.
It's a perfect segue, candidly, Rick, and thank you for the kind words. I think what we're trying to do is just that. We recognize that as venue operators, your time is valued, and you only have enough time to really focus on, a bird's eye view sometimes. And so sometimes we do things in-house, sometimes we outsource. And I think, it used to be that outsource was kind of a bad word, right? People never, oh no, you do that, they're not going to be as engaging. They're not going to understand our customer. They're not going to understand, our team and our as much. They're not going to be as dedicated. And I think that's where you'll find the folks that we're looking to try to bring to the table through this consultancy, an opportunity to accelerate that time and that value for you as we go through this journey. And, Lou and I have been talking about this here on and off for the past year or so, about how we can improve fan and facility safety through the eyes of experts that we can bring to the table, including John and Kathleen and yourself and others that are a part of IIFX, but there is a plethora of technology companies. There are a number of companies that, quite frankly, are having that same issue you talked about, and that is just to get their foot in the door. When you have somebody that is trusted and that has the experience of running things in the past, you're going to likely, take that call before you would, a cold call from somebody else. And so that's why we're just trying to break down some of those barriers as we talk through the fan journey. Lou, you want to talk a little more about it?
Just maybe turn it over to you to wrap it up. And well, before we wrap it up, what a great podcast, Kathleen. Thank you so much, Rick, John. Fantastic hour here or so for this podcast. And Jim, I'll ask you to wrap it up and thank you, the listeners, for being with us here today. So, Jim, wrap it up.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Listen, I think first and foremost, this is when we talk about safety and safety being first, it's just one of those things that in the industry, we just don't want to, we'll never compromise it, right? It's got to be something that is almost not even talked about as from the standpoint that it's something that's off the table. It is just understood that everybody is expecting when they come into these venues to be safe and want to know what you're doing. And so I would encourage you to reach out to the Johns of the world, to the Kathleens, the Rick Fentons, but use IIFX in such a way that we can be that conduit for you as we look to potentially do some things with you on a consultancy basis, right? If you have the time, great. If you don't have the time, reach out through IIFX and we'll look at ways in which we might be able to assist you in your endeavors. But I really wanted to say thank you very much to everybody that was on the call today listening, certainly to the panel, and to you, Lou, for your steadfast support and direction. We'll leave it at that. Have a great weekend, everybody, and enjoy the Super Bowl that's coming up.
Go Niners.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, what a